and gentlemen, and welcome to Anime. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Game Theory, where nothing is wrong or different in the slightest. Nothing has changed at all, trust me. So, I want to be real for a second. Doki Doki Literature Club is something I was blindsided by. There are very few experiences that affect me in any way now. I've watched a lot of anime and movies, played a lot of video games, but few things ever completely consume me like this game did. Ever since I finished it a month ago, I have been unable to get it from my head. Please, if you have even the vaguest interest, go to Steam right now and play it completely blind. It's free. Despite what it looks and sounds like, I can promise you that you're in for the experience of a lifetime. I'm dead serious, this isn't something you want to be spoiled for. It's about 5 hours long, and trust me, it may start slow, but you're in for one heck of a roller coaster. Okay, I think I've given enough of a warning, let's get on with the theory. So, this was certainly something, wasn't it? I was recommended this by my friend Troy, which sounds fine until you realize that he essentially sent me a dating sim for no reason. That was enough to get me suspicious. I mean, it's not like I've actually played this kind of game, except that one time, and maybe I played that one as well. Oh no. Oh boy, I might be transforming into a weeb as we speak. Regardless, oh boy, I was not ready for what I was in for. This wasn't a dating sim, it was a nightmare. Regardless, it had such an impact that I pretty much knew I needed to do some videos on it. Don't worry, today is just a minor theory, just an appetizer before the conspiracy type stuff we're getting into next week. That being said, let's talk about manipulation. Something I've always found interesting is when a work can actively manipulate you to act and react in certain ways to make certain events more interesting. In this game's case, well, geez, there's a ridiculous amount of manipulation going on behind the scenes. Most people like to talk about the stuff in Arc 2 and 3, but I'd argue some of the most interesting manipulation comes in with the first arc. So sit tight or just hang around for a bit, because I'm covering what this game did to make you, the player, do certain things to make Sayori's event at the end of Arc 1 all the more impactful. So firstly, I feel the need to mention that with these kinds of things, nothing can ever be 100%. There will always be cases out of the norm, so I'm more talking about what the game tries to get you to do. Just keep this in mind as you're watching. So, if you're going in blind, you're likely going to assume that this is going to be a regular dating sim. With that, there are usually certain expectations you'll come in with, the most important one being that in most cases, you choose one of the potential girls to get with. In most cases, you start down an arc and that's it. You usually want to see the conclusion of one route before heading down another. And this is where some of the more subtle manipulation starts, because you see, the game actively pushed you to go down a certain route, that being Yuri's. Let's look at the first day, for example. Upon introducing each of the characters, the game treats each one of them very differently. Natsuki is a tsundere to begin with, meaning that most people will decide immediately whether they'll choose her or not. You like tsunderes? You're probably going down Natsuki's route. If not, her strong personality will most likely drive people away. With Sayori, ironically, the game introduces her in a very negative way. The game almost seems to portray her as a burden initially. It may be small, but these kind of impressions will stick with someone much longer because the game outright told you that she's mildly annoying. Yuri, however, is introduced as the most normal of the three. Sure, she's shy, but inevitably, that's usually seen as a positive. Out of the three, she's the most likely to be chosen because the game doesn't want to drive you away from her like the other two. Now, to be fair, from the sound of that, it's not much on its own, but there are more details that make this more sure, because the game really wants you to go down Yuri's route the most, and if that doesn't work, it wants you to choose Natsuki. The game really doesn't want you to choose Sayori for reasons we'll be discussing later. One detail that adds to this, however, is the poetry writing segments of the game. Since this is the main way someone can choose a route, it means that here would be the best place for more manipulation, just in case the subtle cues from before don't work. To be frank, the game makes it way easier to pick Natsuki or Yuri's words based on what you know initially. Since the game makes it a point to say Natsuki likes cute things, it's easy to gather that the cute sounding words will help sway Natsuki. Considering how intellectual the game makes Yuri out to be initially, it only makes sense to choose the more complicated words for her. Sayori, however, is much more difficult to grasp. Her words are more just whatever. The closest to a hint you even get is that Sayori likes less complex emotions, but that doesn't really make sense for words like fireflies or vacation. The game makes her route the hardest to get to, as she's the hardest to define. These things may not seem like much on their own, but combined they drastically affect the chances of someone picking her. What would initially seem like an even split suddenly becomes much more weighed heavily on Yuri's end, and leaves the chances of someone getting with Sayori much lower by comparison. And once you pick a girl, you're unlikely to change down the line if you're playing it like a normal dating sim. You assume you can just go down a different route later, so once you pick Yuri, you're unlikely to suddenly feel like hanging with the other two. Oh my gosh, that was not intended. What the... Now, this is all interesting, but the question is, why? Why would they want you to pick the other girls? What difference does it make really in the end? Well, quite a bit actually. It's all in the goal of making sure the event at the end of the act is all the more painful to get to. There's a bit to unpack here, so hang tight. Stop. Okay, what? Why? So firstly, anyone who's played the game knows by this point that Sayori was suffering from depression. Now sure, the indication is that Monica was messing with her from behind the scenes, but it's clear looking at the evidence that Sayori had depression beforehand. What evidence, you ask? Well, the main focus of the game, the poems themselves. A close reading of any of the poems can give you a much deeper dive into the character's psyche than you'd initially imagine, and Sayori is no different. Look at her first poem, for example. Dear Sunshine, the way you glow through my blinds in the morning, it makes me feel like you missed me. Kissing my forehead to help me out of bed, making me rub the sleepy from my eyes. Are you asking me to come out and play? Are you trusting me to wish away a rainy day? I look above, the sky is blue. It's a secret, but I trust you too. If it wasn't for you, I could sleep forever, but I'm not mad. I want breakfast. It's clear that the sunshine in the poem isn't literal, but instead, the sunshine she's referring to is actually the main character. Reading it this way makes it more interesting. Are you asking me to come out and play? Are you trusting me to wish away a rainy day? Essentially, just as she believes the main character needs her to keep him happy, she also inevitably needs him to stick around to be happy as well. She says this much when she finally reveals that she's had depression. If it wasn't for you, I could sleep forever, but I'm not mad, I want breakfast. In this case, sleep forever essentially means give up entirely. The main character is keeping her alive, and is making it possible for her to get up in the morning. And if you're wondering, the second poem is much more blunt about the truth than this one. It may not seem like much initially, but it's impactful in two different ways. One, if the player begins to figure out the truth beforehand while on another route, it'll only make them feel worse. Two, if the player is unable to figure this out beforehand, it makes these poems, which are borderline pleas for help, all the sadder to look back at. It has a double effect regardless of which occurs, but the end goal is to make you feel bad, specifically if you're on another route. This whole aspect gets even more important in the next point. Out of all the days you could find out the truth about her condition, it ends up being the one day where reacting to it is basically impossible. Despite finally learning the truth, the player is then forced to spend the rest of the time with either Yuri or Natsuki. If you somehow ended up on the Sayori route, then this is bad because essentially you're ignoring the one you chose who has a serious issue and are instead spending the day with one of the other two having fun. If you are on another route, you're essentially giving your best friend the shaft to go suck on some girl's finger for a bit. Congratulations, you're terrible. Chances are as well that the player will have entirely forgotten about the whole depression thing while on the date with Yuri or Natsuki, only for it to come slap you right in the face at the end. When the confession scene finally arrives, you're given one of two choices to make. You can either tell Sayori that you love her, potentially jumping off your previous route, or you can reject her. Now, in a technical sense, the end result would seem to be the same, but it's the emotions it brings about that differ drastically between these choices. There's a clear difference in how each of these choices go down. If you say you love her, the feeling seems bittersweet, but regardless, there seems to be some semblance of this being a nice choice. Rejecting her, though? Nope, she literally runs away crying. Now, the obvious choice would seem that you'd want to choose the confession, but things aren't that simple. Remember, if you think this is just a normal dating sim, is it really worth sacrificing the route you're on at this point? If you're playing it like it's a normal dating sim, chances are you won't sacrifice the route. You'll just go down the Sayori route a different time to make up for it. And since the chances of picking either Natsuki or Yuri initially is much higher, it makes this choice even likelier than before, and this all leads into the climax of the arc. When the Avatar finally walks upstairs to find his best friend's lifeless body, all of this stuff will have piled up by this point. In most cases when someone dies, it's not what was done that causes regret, it's the things that aren't done. Which sounds worse to you? Trying to fix things with your best friend before she kills herself, or entirely ignoring her for another girl before she kills herself? It's that regret that makes this death even more painful to grasp. And since you were likely going down either the Yuri route or the Natsuki route, this is likely what occurred. Essentially, you did ignore your best friend for the sake of getting with Yuri for her posture. But you know, if all of this manipulation wasn't enough to make this scene worse, there's one more detail I feel the need to talk about, since I'm pretty much known for making things much more screwed up. I feel the need to warn you that we're getting all Logan Paul up in here and analyzing a lifeless body. If you're not comfortable enough to look at it, just go to another tab and listen, I guess. Oh boy, here we go. Now, firstly, it's obvious by the tattered clothes and bloodstains on her hands that she messed up. She essentially sat there and struggled for quite a sum of time as her instincts kicked in. Now, that's bad, but what's worse is when she died. Look at the blood. It's still bright red. It hasn't really dried up at all, and her eyes haven't faded much either. In the other case where we see a dead body, Yuri's eyes are essentially gone, and the blood turns completely dark in less than a day. It's clear that this death was recent, and considering the signs, I'd say she probably did this earlier in the morning, just around the time where you could have come in and stopped it all. Essentially, when Monica says you left Sayori hanging that morning, it's literal. If you'd come over that day to wake her up, you likely would have had a chance to save her. Perhaps she sat there hoping you'd show up and save her, and when you never did, she just decided to end it all. What the heck? Why did I write this? Regardless, the manipulation that Doki Doki Literature Club goes through makes the event all the more screwed up, and that's quite impressive. The game almost forces you to avoid Sayori's route, in subtle and not so subtle ways, only to use your dating sim instincts against you. All of this is done in an effort to make sure that Sayori's death is all the worse. All these details are impressive, and personally, I really wanted to talk about this subject. Thankfully, for those of you who want something a bit crazier, well, don't worry yourself. Next week, we'll be getting into something pretty nuts, and some of it I guarantee you've never heard. I've made some interesting discoveries. You'll have to wait and see. And hey, if you enjoyed this video, why don't you like the video and subscribe and... Why isn't the end card loaded? It's a little weird, but alright. See you guys in the next video, I guess.